Settle in now, and let the quiet weight of history descend upon us, for the pages we turn now hold the chronicle of an extraordinary betrayal, a moment when a nation chose to turn the sword against itself, not for foreign conquest, but for the fundamental right to govern its own soul. We are approaching the heart of the 17th century, a period often simply referred to as the English Civil War, but which was, in its essence, a profound and terrifying English Revolution. Take a slow, quiet breath. You are entering a landscape where the king believed his authority was a gift from God, and his people believed their liberties were a gift from time immemorial. The collision of these two unyielding doctrines would shatter a kingdom and ultimately lead to the unimaginable act of regicide. Our chronicle begins not with the sound of cannon, but with the subtle, grinding tension between the crown and parliament, a friction that had been building for generations, but which reached its crisis point with the ascension of King Charles I in 1625. Charles I was a man of immense personal dignity, a devout Anglican, and an unwavering believer in the doctrine of divine right of kings. The solemn conviction that his authority to rule was derived directly from God, making him accountable to no earthly power, certainly not a mere assembly of commoners and noblemen. This profound, almost spiritual conviction was the fundamental flaw in his political character, for it rendered him utterly incapable of compromise with the growing constitutional and financial demands of his subjects. The tension was immediate and absolute, primarily centered on finance and religion. Regarding finance, a king ruling by divine right required no permission to levy taxes. However, by long-standing English custom, Parliament held the exclusive power to grant the king funds for wars and government operations. When Charles I found Parliament resistant to his demands for money, especially for his disastrous foreign wars, he simply dissolved it, famously initiating the 11 Years' Tyranny 1629 to 1640, a period during which he ruled without Parliament, seeking funds through obscure, antiquated, or controversial means. Imagine the quiet, growing resentment across the wealthy and landowning classes, the forced loans, the manipulation of royal monopolies, and, most famously, the collection of ship money, a tax traditionally levied only on coastal towns during wartime for the Royal Navy, which Charles I extended illegally and in peacetime to the entire resistant inland country. These actions were perceived not merely as taxation without consent, but as a deliberate, systematic attempt to undermine the established constitutional balance of the kingdom and install an absolute, European-style monarchy. The religious crisis, simultaneously unfolding, was equally potent and far more incendiary. Charles I, along with his zealous Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, promoted a high church, formalistic version of Anglicanism, a style that emphasized ritual, vestments, and ecclesiastical hierarchy, often perceived by many as dangerously close to the Catholic practices that the nation had firmly rejected. This aggressive imposition of Laudianism provoked the deepest fears of the substantial and politically active Puritan element in England. The Puritans, who were deeply Calvinist, sought to purify the Church of England entirely of Catholic influence, favoring simple worship, strict personal morality, and the supremacy of preaching over ritual. They viewed Laudian policies as a terrifying return to Roman Catholicism, a betrayal of the Protestant settlement, and a sign of the king's fundamental spiritual untrustworthiness. This religious pressure became the immediate catalyst for the Revolution. When Charles I and Laud attempted to impose a new, Laudian-style prayer book on the fiercely Presbyterian Scots, the Scottish nobles and commoners signed the National Covenant in 1638, raising an army and initiating the Bishops' Wars. Charles I, utterly unable to defeat the Covenanters without an army, and utterly unable to fund an army without money, was finally forced, after 11 years of solitary rule, to recall Parliament in 1640 to beg for funds. This deeply humbled and financially desperate king opened the doors to the assembly that would finally clip the wings of his divine right. The Long Parliament 1640 to 1660 was not interested in providing funds. It was interested in exacting justice and settling constitutional scores. It swiftly impeached and executed Charles's chief ministers, including Archbishop Laud and the Earl of Strafford. More crucially, it passed a series of foundational acts that fundamentally curtailed royal power, abolishing the prerogative courts like the Star Chamber, making ship money illegal, and, most decisively, passing the Triennial Act, which mandated that Parliament must be called at least once every 3 years, preventing the king from dissolving it at will. The moment of irreparable constitutional rupture arrived in January 1642. Fearing the growing radicalism and power of Parliament, Charles I, accompanied by armed guards, famously marched into the House of Commons chamber with the intention of arresting 5 leading members, including the charismatic John Pym, on charges of treason. The members had been warned and had already fled by boat down the Thames River. This single, aggressive act, the violation of the sacred physical space of Parliament by the monarch, was viewed as an outrageous assault on the liberties of the English people. The king had revealed his willingness to use military force against the legally assembled body of the nation. With London turning hostile and Parliament seizing control of the militia, Charles I realized his position in the capital was untenable. He fled London for the north, establishing his court and standard at Nottingham in August 1642. This solemn, powerful act, the raising of the royal standard, was the formal declaration of war, the end of the political skirmish, and the beginning of the bloody, agonizing, armed conflict that would define the next decade of English life. The nation was now irrevocably divided between the Royalists' Cavaliers and the Parliamentarians' Roundheads. We move now into the years of civil conflict, a time when the peaceful fields of England were stained with the blood of its own citizens, and the constitutional arguments of the lawyers were replaced by the harsh, decisive rhetoric of the sword. The First English Civil War, 164 to 1646, was a struggle defined by shifting fortunes, but ultimately by the superior organization and spiritual conviction of the parliamentarian forces. The Royalists' Cavaliers drew their main strength from the landed gentry, the aristocracy, and the more rural, northern, and western regions of the country. They fought for the king and the Anglican Church, believing tradition and hierarchy to be the necessary bulwarks against democratic chaos. Their strength lay in their experienced, aristocratic cavalry and the speed of their initial movements. The Parliamentarians' Roundheads found their support primarily in the commercial, Puritan-heavy, wealthy South and East, including the vital city of London. They fought for Parliament, the Protestant religion, and the ancient liberties of the English subject. Their initial military efforts were often hampered by divided command and hesitant leadership. The early years saw several inconclusive battles, with the Royalists achieving notable, though not decisive, victories. The first truly significant engagement was the Battle of Edgehill in 1642, which ended in a stalemate, yet prevented the king from seizing London. It quickly became clear that the professional army of the crown, led by the king's nephew, the brilliant cavalry commander Prince Rupert of the Rhine, was difficult to defeat. The turning point was not a single battle, but a foundational military transformation driven by a single, extraordinary man, Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell, a deeply religious Puritan and a member of Parliament, recognized that the parliamentarian army, often composed of reluctant militia, lacked the spiritual zeal and professional discipline of the Royalists. He famously declared that they needed men of spirit, men who had a fear of God, for these were the only ones who would have the courage to face death and stand firm against the Cavalier charge. Cromwell created the Ironsides, a regiment of highly disciplined, religiously motivated, and immensely effective cavalry. His soldiers, paid regularly and promoted on merit-ratherology rather than birthright, fought with the uncompromising fervor of men who believed they were executing God's will on earth. This highly successful model of professionalism and zeal was eventually expanded to form the New Model Army in 1645. This was the first truly professional, standardized, and religiously unified standing army in English history. Led by Sir Thomas Fairfax and Cromwell, the New Model Army, distinguished by its red coats and its Puritan conviction, became the irresistible engine of parliamentarian victory. The sheer, overwhelming power of this new, disciplined force was demonstrated decisively at the Battle of Naseby in 1645. The New Model Army utterly crushed the main Royalist field army, effectively ending the First Civil War. The king's military resistance collapsed rapidly thereafter, and in 1646, Charles I surrendered to the Scottish army, who promptly handed him over to the English Parliament. The First Civil War had been fought and won, but the essential question of sovereignty remained completely unresolved. The king was defeated, yet the nation was profoundly divided over what the new constitutional settlement should be. This period of negotiation 1646-1648 was marked by escalating tension between three primary factions. The king, Charles I, held captive, refused to yield his divine right, believing that God would eventually restore him, and using his time to sow division among his enemies. Parliament, the Presbyterians. This moderate faction sought a compromise that would restore the king with strictly limited powers and establish a Presbyterian church, fearing the radicalism of the army, the independents, and radicals, the New Model Army. Increasingly politicized and radicalized, demanded not just a limited monarchy, but religious toleration and sweeping political reform, including universal male suffrage, championed by radical groups like the Levelers. The king, capitalizing on the political divide, made a secret deal with the Scots, promising them Presbyterianism in exchange for their military support. This betrayal led directly to the Second English Civil War in 1648, a brief but brutal conflict that reignited royalist risings across England and brought the Scottish army across the border once more. The New Model Army, led by Cromwell, swiftly and decisively crushed the royalist risings and defeated the Scottish army at the Battle of Preston. This second conflict proved to be the absolute, irreversible turning point. The army leadership concluded that the king was utterly untrustworthy, a man of blood who would never accept a genuine peace and whose duplicity was directly responsible for the renewed bloodshed. The army decided to take matters into its own hands. In December 1648, under the command of Colonel Thomas Pride, soldiers forcibly blocked or arrested the moderate Presbyterian members of Parliament who still wished to negotiate with the king. This act, known as Pride's Purge, cleared the House of Commons of all those opposed to the army's radical agenda, leaving behind only a small, pliant remnant known contemptuously as the Rump Parliament. The Rump Parliament, now entirely dominated by the army's desire for final resolution, immediately passed an ordinance creating a High Court of Justice to try the king for treason against the people of England. The fundamental shift was complete. The sovereignty of the nation was placed above the person of the monarch. The stage was set for the trial of a king, an unprecedented and terrifying act that would send shockwaves across the monarchies of Europe. The culmination of the English Revolution arrived in the bitterly cold January of 1649. With the trial and execution of King Charles I, this was the moment of absolute constitutional rupture, an act so profound and irreversible that it defined the very essence of the revolution. The trial of a king by his own subjects for treason was an unprecedented event. Charles I stood before the High Court of Justice in Westminster Hall, maintaining his dignity and refusing to recognize the court's legality, asserting that no earthly power had the right to judge him, as his authority came only from God. His quiet, solemn defiance only strengthened the resolve of the army. On January 30th, 1649, Charles I was led to the scaffold erected outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. Before a massive, silent crowd, he delivered a dignified final speech, reaffirming his innocence and his belief in divine right, before laying his head upon the block. The executioner delivered the single, heavy blow. Imagine the deep, collective, and terrible groan that rose from the assembled thousands, a sound of national trauma and awe. The king was dead. The ancient, sacred link between God and the crown was violently severed by the will of the People's Army. Immediately following the regicide, the Rump Parliament abolished the monarchy, the House of Lords, and the concept of divine right. In May 1649, England was declared a commonwealth, a free state governed without king or House of Lords. This was the true moment of Republican revolution. The Commonwealth 1649 to 1653 was, in principle, a republic, but in reality, it was a state governed by the Rump Parliament under the overwhelming power and vigilance of the new model army. The primary challenges facing the new republic were immediate and existential. Ireland and Scotland, both nations refused to recognize the regicide or the new Commonwealth. Charles II, the eldest son of the executed king, was immediately proclaimed king by the Scots and by royalist forces in Ireland. Internal dissension, radical groups within the army and society, such as the Levellers and the Diggers, demanded further sweeping social and political reforms that the new government was unwilling to grant. Oliver Cromwell was the man called upon to resolve these challenges, a task he completed with brutal efficiency. Cromwell's campaigns in Ireland 1649 to 1650 were swift and devastatingly cruel. Seeking to crush the royalist forces and secure the new regime, the new model army conducted massacres at Drogheda and Wexford, which are remembered as horrific atrocities to this day. Cromwell justified the violence as divine retribution, leading to the subjugation of Ireland and the mass confiscation of Irish land for English settlement, a legacy of immense bitterness. Next, Cromwell turned on Scotland, which had crowned Charles II. After a series of decisive victories at Dunbar 1650 and Worcester 1651, the last major royalist field army was annihilated, forcing Charles II into exile on the continent. The three kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland were forcibly unified under the command of the Commonwealth. With the foreign enemies vanquished and the internal dissent suppressed, Cromwell grew increasingly frustrated with the Rump Parliament. The parliamentarians, having tasted power, were reluctant to dissolve themselves or implement the broad, structural reforms the army demanded. In 1653, Cromwell marched into the House of Commons, delivered a scathing denunciation of the members, and declared, "I say you are no parliament," effectively dissolving the assembly by force. This act, the closure of the very body that had fought the king for sovereignty, revealed that the revolution had consumed its own legislative origins. Following this purge, Cromwell was installed as Lord Protector of the Commonwealth, initiating the period known as the Protectorate 1653 to 1659. This was essentially a military dictatorship, a government ruled by one man with the backing of the army. Cromwell attempted to govern as a civilian ruler, utilizing several parliaments and a written constitution, the instrument of government. His rule brought stability, religious tolerance for most Protestants, though not for Catholics or Quakers, and aggressive foreign policy successes. However, his authority ultimately rested on the sword, not on constitutional legitimacy. The country was divided into districts governed by the major generals, effectively imposing a Puritan military rule that was deeply resented by much of the traditional gentry. When Oliver Cromwell died in September 1658, the Protectorate, lacking the necessary constitutional legitimacy or the commanding genius of its founder, quickly collapsed. His son, Richard Cromwell, was unable to maintain the support of the turbulent army, and by 1659, the nation was once again sinking toward political instability and the very chaos the revolution had sought to prevent. The military and political leaders, weary of instability and convinced that only the restoration of the traditional government could bring lasting peace and stability, began quiet negotiations. The decisive action was taken by General George Monk, a shrewd commander who marched his forces south from Scotland and orchestrated the recall of the Long Parliament and the negotiation for the return of the exiled king. In 1660, the nation experienced the Restoration. Charles II returned to England from exile and was proclaimed king in London to overwhelming, massive popular celebration. The monarchy was back, the Commonwealth was legally erased, and the decade of republicanism was quietly, decisively buried. Yet the revolution, despite its formal failure, left an indelible mark. The king was not restored to divine right. He returned under the negotiated terms of the Declaration of Breda, which guaranteed indemnity and recognized the constitutional restraints established by the Long Parliament. Monarchical authority was permanently limited. The concept that a king could be tried, executed, and replaced remained a powerful, terrifying check on royal absolutism. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 would later be the final constitutional settlement, building upon the foundations laid by the Civil War, permanently establishing the supremacy of Parliament and the rule of law over the caprice of the monarch. The English Revolution, in its devastating violence, its radical republicanism, and its final, exhausted surrender to restoration, forged a new, enduring constitutional balance for the nation, one in which the crown could only rule with the unwavering consent of Parliament.